Hi, everybody. Welcome to Between the Vines. I initially thought this would be our last update during harvest, but it looks like harvest is going to be longer. So I'm here with Andy and Jennifer, the rest of the team, to bring you another harvest update. And we'll keep doing this until harvest is over. We don't know when that will be, but it will probably be related to snowfall or something terrible like that. Um, so harvest is progressing in our Lake Erie region and the Finger Lakes as well, particularly with Concords. A lot of other things that are done earlier are done, and it's been an interesting year.
Certainly has. Is it still raining where you are, wherever that is out there? Just asking.
So yeah, I mean that's been a challenge I think during harvest is not just that Brix accumulation is a challenge by itself, but there has been a lot of rainfall during harvest. I think you mentioned that Brix accumulation is tough because of berry size related to earlier rains in maybe July or August or September, but now just dilution during harvest. We have a lot of acreage that's close to maturity or close to what the minimum standards are. And it's very difficult to try to do field testing of Brix and make sure that you are going to meet those minimum standards when conditions change. If it takes you 45 minutes or 2 hours to pick a load, the level of rainfall and leaf wetness relates to Brix. So it's been difficult and challenging. And I think for individual growers, a lot of canceled loads. I don't know that certainly the harvesters are not reporting those challenge or the processors are not reporting those challenges. I think they're finding because there's just so much crop, they can fill in those gaps at the plant with somebody else's stuff. Um,
Doesn't make it easier on the ones who had to cancel their loads.
right. Yeah. If you look at individual growers, at least some of the growers I've talked to, and just based on how long the processors are planning to stay open, it sounds like there's a lot of acreage that is still not harvested, even though the plants have been, I think, at capacity. With a crop this large, really the capacity of the plant is usually the concentrator and or how much they're trucking somewhere else to find storage outside of the region. And it seems like they're at that capacity. So
Well, do you have an update on how far or how late processors are growing? I know I've heard bits and pieces.
yeah, so some of the processors that go later, I think, are actually going to end within the next week or so because I think they're going to run out of storage. Um, but sometime between the 4th and the 13th of November is when, depending on which processor, when harvest is at least forecasted to end. And I think a lot of that is planning. I don't know, you know, those are predictions based on the processor. My guess would be, if anything, the 4th might actually be later than that, and the 13th it might actually be earlier than that. Um, but there certainly is a lot of unharvested acreage. It's just, you can't harvest grapes in 2 feet of snow, so we know that that will be ruled out. We just don't know if that will happen. And if we get a lot of sunny weather, maybe things will pick up in terms of how much tonnage is brought in. So I think I think it's very difficult to forecast at this point. We're certainly seeing some more shelling. Um, so actual tonnage yields that end up at the plant are going to vary as well. So I don't know, I
Right.
don't know how much is going to fall off, and it'll depend on when it gets harvested. But sugar solids are not accumulating very quickly at the plant. So I think what's happening is as they accumulate in the vineyard, they go from something below the minimum standard to the minimum standard, and so then they're brought in. Um, if everything's ripe, typically you see that weighted average sugar solids increases throughout the course of the year at the plant, but we're still seeing loads being brought in under 15, certainly under 16. So we haven't seen too much movement there. A little bit. Um, Looking at probably, if you're looking at Concord for juice, it's the average sugar solids is around 15.6, 15.7. for the Lake Erie region. So quite a bit lower than it normally is because,
It's a lot of
depending on the,
crop.
well, right. And depending on the plant, anything under 14.5 or 14 or 15, they're not accepting that. So to get an average in the mid to high 15s, it means a lot of stuff is being brought in at 15.0, 15.1, 15.2 kind of thing. Because you're not going to get a 13 to weigh down that average in most plants. So um, basically everyone has a Brix standard except Gallo. Gallo will be implementing one next year. This was their first crush, so obviously they're just getting their feet wet and trying to learn what they can do, what they want to do to get the quality that they need. So they did not change very many policies this year, but I think they're going to be implementing something like that next year, and it will be related to the quality they need. It's not going to be 16 Brix or anything like that. That's not really what they're targeting. So, it looks like we're at somewhere in the neighborhood of over 100,000 tons harvested in the region, and that is very typical of a decent crop or slightly below average crop. So we still have a long way to go, probably in the neighborhood of 40,000 tons if it all hangs on.
Right.
Maybe 30 in that range. So there is a ways to go, and I have actually gotten a couple phone calls about this is for a lot of individual growers the largest crop that they've ever seen by far. So one of the questions is, what does that mean for price? Because if you go back 20 years, especially if you go back 20 years, but even today, if I have a giant crop, I don't get paid. So $200 times 10 tons to the acre or $400 times 5 ton to the acre, it's kind of a wash. Is that what's going to happen this year? I don't know, obviously, but what I do know, right? But what I do know is that there are a lot of indicators that point to that not being the case in this year. Results were not as positive and certainly not record breaking for Concord processing in other parts of the United States. Small crops, high quality, but very small crops. And also other crop prices are very high. Processing apple prices are setting some ridiculous records.
I think prices are high across the board, across commodities everywhere. Don't you agree?
Right. I think it's pretty logical to assume that consumers are just going to pay more for juice. And I don't know if that's a forever thing or if it's a right now thing, but you know, um, there was a lot of resistance to higher price groceries when, say, the only thing that was more expensive was grape juice. But right now it's everything, or it's enough things, it's almost everything, that it's more of a consumer expectation and a lack of choice. Like, you still got to eat, and you're still going to buy sort of what you're going to buy. And if you prefer grape juice to apple juice, so you're willing to pay 30 cents more for it, the price difference might still only be 30 cents, but the price itself is up. It's not like in a frost year where, apple juice is $1 for a container, like for a quart, and grape juice is 10. And I'm exaggerating there, but that's not the case here. These prices are based on overall macroeconomic changes in the economy. Corn is high, input costs are high. And I mean, part of the bad news is I think growers are going to win, at least for now, but part of the bad news is their expenses are going to be much higher as well. So yes, gross revenue is going to be through the roof this year if things work out well. We already know that for the cash market. There are some growers who already have completed harvesting for the cash market, so we already know what their gross revenue is going to be like. Cooperatives are a bit more of a wild card, and people who still have 1,000 tons in the vineyard, that's a little bit of a wild card. But for some growers, we know that their gross revenues, we already know for sure their gross revenue is going to be crazy high. But we know their expenses are going to be up. I think in the end, it's going to wash out to higher profitability, but it's not going to be as ridiculous as it might seem. You're not going to use your $400 or $350 Concord to buy $9 a gallon Roundup. Like the input costs are going to change as well as the revenue. So it's a complicated process in terms of business planning because there are going to be some unknowns on what things are going to cost.
I was just going to ask that. I actually have two questions that I wanted to ask. I didn't want to interrupt you. Number one, do you think this is the latest harvest that you've seen in a while? Like it's the latest one I've been a part of.
So it's
Don't forget my
close, but
contact.
no. Yeah, it's close, but no. There, I think scheduling out till the 13th of November probably breaks a bit of a record. Um, there has been there have been processors that harvest that late, especially I think it was the last couple of years, to get um, fruit that was not marketed that they realized they needed at a later date. So somebody didn't have a marketing contract, the tanks weren't full, and Concord prices were rising, so those were purchased, and maybe growers who didn't expect to harvest ended up harvesting later. Um, but certainly the first week of November, which puts us at the 6th, is fairly common for a late year. I think what's really surprising about this year is we started this year off a week early. And so from if you looked at it from bloom date to end of harvest, it's by far the longest season we've ever had. So,
Wow.
so the vacation that you get before you start spraying or the vacation that you get right after harvest, if you took two vacations, and I know growers don't actually do that, but if you did, they're further apart than they probably ever have been, would be my guess.
Got
I think
it.
that's what's really unusual. And I think, I was going to talk to Kim about this and maybe one of us could write it up, but I think what's truly unusual about this year that I don't know if we've ever seen it, and that's why I want to talk to Kim about it and get her to look at that data to see if it's ever happened. Um, this was a warm, wet year, and it still is. I mean, it's the 27th of October. We haven't had a frost yet. We haven't really had a frost scare. That's unusual, especially in a wet year. I think typically we have cold, wet years that are a disaster, and we have hot, dry years that are wonderful for ripening a crop. And then we have things that are in between. But the rainfall is certainly above average at this point, and temperatures are also way above average.
Yeah. I've been looking at the projected forecast for Portland, New York.
Mhm.
And this weekend is definitely still wet, but the lowest temps we have in the next 7 days is 38. We're
Right.
still in the 60s.
Yeah, and without looking at that data, I don't know if it's going to show up as obvious because, 38 is cold. It's not that much above average. I think what's unique is the fact that we started out so early and now we are so late, and we haven't had issues at this tail end of the season with any sort of frost. In the meantime, it's been raining the whole time, so I think that's what's unusual. So I guess the question really is that going to show up in growing degree days, or is it because 38 degrees is not exactly growing degree days. So, so it'll be interesting to see how you look at that data to see if there's a way that it jumps out as unusual, but it might not. But it
My
certainly
other,
was unusual.
so my other question, this is purely speculation on your part, and I'm putting you on the spot here, and you might not even have any trends looking at it, but in my own personal experience with buying certain materials and stuff within the last year, a year ago, right around now, they were like, prices will come down, don't worry about it. And prices have only increased. What are we looking in regards to their inputs as far as, potash and nitrogen sprays? Are you seeing them level off? I know you saw them increasing over the summer.
Right. No. So it depends on which commodity that you're looking at purchasing, but it's very similar trends. So the more related to corn it is, the worse it is. For example, Roundup looks like it could be very problematic. Rely or Cheetah or glufosinate also problematic in terms of price. Other things like Allion that were already expensive and sort of out of the reach of, say, most field crops, I don't think the movement's been there, but it is a little early to sort of speculate on some of those prices right now. A lot of that price information comes out a little bit later. Um, in terms of fertilizer, it for the most part, the trends are the same. It's been more dramatic in potash now, which is bad for us. Earlier in the year, it was more of the other fertilizers that were rising more quickly. They were all going up fast. They were all going up a lot. I think potassium was the least dramatic, and now it's the most. So that's sort of bad news for our industry. And I would say that I would defer to you in terms of what a maintenance rate would be, but I would think your maintenance rate this year is already going to be, in terms of quantity, double if your crop was double. So we can also double the price on top of that, and you're going to spend 4 times as much on potash if you're doing things the way you should.
So I was worried about when I was formulating the question.
Right.
There's a huge crop out there.
I call it 4x. For every dollar you spent last year doing a maintenance application, you're going to spend 4 this year, because you're going to need twice as much and you're going to spend twice as much on it. And last year was not the bottom of the potash market, so it was already up probably 20% last year, a year ago, and it's up about 100% since then. So that'll sting a little bit. Hopefully you're not trying to do a build program of potash, and we've been saying that since the spring. Hopefully you already did that. That's outside of my control of whether that you fell into that or not. I think there probably are there's probably a decent amount of acreage in a build program, because you see grape prices rise, you see people taking over farms that were in poor care, and good farmers that typically do good things with potassium are trying to fix a problem maybe that somebody else created, and that's just going to be more expensive this time around. But if Concord prices maintain themselves, it will make sense from a profitability standpoint. Just the numbers involved will be larger. So that's probably not great news or what people wanted to hear. We've been hearing the same thing in other areas that you wouldn't necessarily suspect, that have never happened, like good luck buying a tractor. The cost of tires has been rising very quickly. So for somebody like me, I've never experienced inflation. It's not, I can read about it in a history book. Like, that's the extent of my knowledge on inflation and how it plays out. Probably some of our growers have a little bit more experience in it, but it's been a long time. And even our older growers, they might have lived through the 70s in the earlier part of their career, but it's been a long time. And trying to figure out where consumers and businesses are going to react to inflation, because inflation is really all about expectation. And we've expected to not have inflation for the better part of 40 years. You wouldn't expect it to come from tires, but here we are, because supply chain and shipping issues. So.
Well, I know I can't get warm and dry.
Yes, we could really use some dry weather. I do think, unfortunately, for a lot of our growers, maybe they've been right on the cusp of a minimum standard for Brix for a long time, and it just keeps raining. So, you're not accumulating a lot of Brix the last couple of weeks, which nobody would expect after the 11th or 18th of October to move much. And, if you went from 14.6 to 14.9 and it's raining all the time, I don't know, you might be scared to take those grapes almost anywhere, not just trying to make 15, but no matter what the standard is, when we've seen some of the rains we've had, it becomes problematic. So hopefully
they qualify for crop insurance, right? I mean, rain is a qualifying.
Yes. So I think there's a little bit of confusion about what crop insurance does and doesn't cover, but I do think most of that confusion is growers that don't have crop insurance, because you don't get any sort of formal education from your agent if you don't have an agent.
Right.
But I do think most growers who have crop insurance and have collected claims in the past are probably familiar with the process. But if you do have questions, we can answer them. But basically, if you're taking care of your grapes, they don't require you to go above and beyond. So do you have to, like, what would happen if you put on 14 sprays for Concord? What if that actually made them ripen? Like if you were at 14.9, one might make the argument that if you had put on 14 sprays, you would have hit 15. Maybe, I don't know. But that's not at all what they require. And you're also not required to thin your crop. There was some talk about requiring crop estimation and documenting that as a minimum practice. I don't know if I don't think they ever finalized that or made that change to the program. It would make sense to me because I'm a big fan of knowing like what your risk is. So essentially what that means is, there were weather related events that led to a larger than normal crop, assuming you actually pruned. And then there were weather related events that caused that crop to not ripen. Yes, there were opportunities for human intervention along the way that would have manipulated things that would have led to it ripening, but they are not necessarily minimum practices.
Got it.
There may be.
And does it even matter because there's such a huge crop out there this year? Do they go off of your last 10 years? What's the average that they go off of?
Yeah, it's a little more complicated than 10 years. There's some low crops get knocked off the average, and it helps out your average a little bit. But in general, you're looking at insurable blocks. So whether or not you have a claim is really going to depend on your inability to harvest the entire insurable block. We certainly had some growers. Certainly if you're harvesting whenever it's sunny, a lot of growers have partially harvested blocks. And, if you harvest half a block that has twice as much crop as you're accustomed to, you're certainly going to be, you could be at 100% or 105% of your average and still have half of the crop out there hanging. And there is no insurance claim for that. That's not considered as a disaster. It's considered an average year. You just happen to have not picked half your crop. So I think there will be a lot of that. I don't think there's too much acreage that is 100% unharvested. But I say that on October 27th, and today there is. It's just plants are still open. So it will depend on how much harvesting happens between now and the end of harvest. There's certainly still vineyards around that there may be an adjuster or an agent that takes issue with the standard of care, poison ivy that looks like trees, and
I've seen it.
Fall grasses above the top wire.
It's away from you.
Yeah, a lot of times fungicide spraying is probably just as important or more important, but it is harder to sort of discover that from an adjuster perspective. So weed control is one of the most important things for making sure the minimum standard of care is complete. Because, if you go out today and you say, hey, look, I couldn't harvest these, they're not going to be able to say, well, the leaves aren't green, because nobody's leaves are green. It's November. So, but certainly fruit rot on the ground can be indication of a problem when you start to see, lots and lots of fruit rot on the ground. And shelling is going to be normal. So even that's going to be a little bit hard to discover. But, I've been around some vineyards this year where there's just clouds of fruit flies. So that's probably going to be something you want to avoid, because that's probably indicative of some standard of care that was absent.
I've inhaled a bunch of those.
Yeah. It's one thing. I think everyone has fruit flies, and that's not what I mean. I mean, when you are struggling to see the sun because there's a cloud. So yeah, crop insurance is a tool. It's certainly not a tool that was designed for a year like this, so it's not going to work in most cases, but that's not to say that it won't work at all. Though one thing that I didn't mention is that I think there might be price impacts in the future, either on the cash market or in real time, because the cash market, their price is set. They can't adjust the 2021 price. But the 2022 price or the 2021 price for cooperatives, there might be some impact on price that's negative, but moderate, because of the cost of containing a crop that's this significant. We're definitely, and this also relates to inflation. There's issues with trucking, there's issues with rail. all of these things are more expensive than maybe the underlying business plan supported. So maybe a processor said, well, if we have to do extra containment costs every 10 years, it doesn't make sense to put up a tank because trucking costs X. Those formulas have changed faster than one could update a business plan and put up a tank for sure. And not that it necessarily makes sense to build storage, but all of those costs are going to be a little bit higher than what a processor would have anticipated. So that could impact next year, depending on how
It makes
sales
my
go.
heart hurt this year because I was so excited for the growers to be getting, a larger payment than normal or in the last couple of years. And then inputs go up. And
well, none of these things, especially standing alone, but even all together, offset the profitability equation, assuming that you meet minimum standards.
okay.
There are some processors that have a significant penalty for, they might say this is the minimum standard, but we also take something lower than that at a significant penalty. That's going to be problematic. I think those growers will still be profitable, but we certainly see a lot of growers who probably left some revenue on the table because they didn't understand how large this crop was. And it was not an easy year to reach that understanding. It was definitely, even people who did a good crop estimation probably missed by 15% or more. But it was not unusual to see people miss by 50, 60, or 80%. And I don't think you would have missed by that much if you had done sort of a Bates level of crop estimation. I could be wrong, but I really don't think so. And having that information, I hope, would have impacted decisions because it certainly is going to impact profitability. There's some 12-ton crops out there that are not going to receive some of these higher payments because they're not going to reach Brix that would allow that. But even with those issues, it's still going to be a good year, I think, for most growers from a profitability standpoint. And there's probably going to be some exceptions to that. If for the growers that really haven't harvested at all, obviously there's going to be some exceptions there. But when you look at the region as a whole, I think we're coming out okay. I shouldn't say came out. I mean, harvest should be over, but here we are, and there's a couple weeks left. So we're working through it.
I'm just giggling because we have a visual of everybody on the call. The people sitting here. Hi, Andy. How are you?
Yeah, if you're in the if you're joining us on the podcast today, I did mention that Andy was with us today. He's been pretty quiet. I think he's been avoiding the vineyards with all the rainfall the last 4 or 5 days, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, you have those arm floaties, and those are hard when you're trying to walk through the canopies.
I've just been here listening to this crop insurance, and to me, being an insect and disease guy, is very, very interesting.
Andy, I can tell you what, I know you're interested in this because you don't just do grapes. I can tell you what armyworm looks like when you put it through the dryer.
Oh, I thought you just left them outside.
Well, I might know somebody that gets their pants so dirty that they get an initial wash outside and then they go through the washer dryer inside, and maybe the armyworm were attracted to the laundered pants.
So do they blow up in the washer and then shrink down again in the dryer? What does it look like?
Well, some of them were
Ew.
There's only about a dozen. But yeah, it was a banner year for armyworm, right, Andy? Not that we need to get into that.
Oh, it was. I had to go out for a bunch of armyworm calls.
Yes, hopefully next year will be a bad year for armyworm.
Not for you. It probably made your life interesting. All right. Well, Andy, if you don't have anything to add about grapes,
I think what I would like to say, and Jen and I, you had talked about it, and Kevin, right before the podcast, is again just to keep in the grower's mind as another reminder about spotted lanternfly. I think as many times as we can alert the growers in our region, the better it is. You know, there's different reports that come in throughout the season, and both in Pennsylvania and New York, there's counties that have reported findings of either dead or live armyworm, no, spotted lanternfly. Armyworm's on the mind. Spotted lanternfly, and just because that happens doesn't mean that, you know, it's here to stay. As far as what we like to do and what's happened in those counties where it's showed up, and even in other states, there's different states that it hasn't been in where they've found live or dead spotted lanternfly. So we want to remind the growers about that. But if you do see that, you know, we do want you to report it immediately.
Very important to report it.
Yeah. So as far as Pennsylvania, it would be to Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And as far as New York, it is New York Ag and Markets, if I'm correct, Jen?
That's correct, yeah.
So, you know, I think in New York, it used to be either Ag and Markets or DEC, but now we want the New York growers to report it to New York Ag and Markets, because that's the entity that will actually have someone in New York come out and you know, confirm your sighting and to check to see if a population is established. And the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture is the one that actually has teams that go out to verify whether or not, you know, it was actually spotted lanternfly, and then to check the area to see if there's actually an established population. So that's very important. The other thing is we would like to, at least the grape growers, or, you know, in my case, since I cover other commodities, other grape growers, say in Erie County, Pennsylvania. But as far as the Lake Erie Regional Program goes, anybody on the team, we'd also like you to contact any of us, because we would like to remain in the loop, or in certain instances, and you had mentioned this, Jen, about maybe taking pictures, sending it to us.
Right.
Then we can verify, you know, whether it is spotted lanternfly or not, and you know, actually come out and check as a double check, and then we can relate that to either Ag and Markets in New York or PDA. Jen, did you
Right.
want to?
And with our relations that we have built up with those organizations, we might get a excuse me, a faster response to, you know, from us verifying and shipping it off, because they are getting from all over the states, Pennsylvania, New York included, they're getting lots of public people are sending in photos, and a lot of them might not be spotted lanternfly, and they have to weed through them. And I would hate to dull that process. So if any of our growers happen to see one and you take a picture, smush it, definitely smush it. You see an egg mask, kill it, hand sanitizer works, put it in a Ziploc bag. Let us know about it. We'll help you report it and also run it up the chain.
Yeah, and as far as that goes, you know, growers should be scouting, and at this point, what they'll should be looking for are either adults or egg masses. And then throughout the winter, you know, if you're in the vineyard, make sure you know what those egg masses look like, and you know, collect a sample if you can. Again, scrape them off and put it in a jar with either, like Jen said, hand sanitizer, which now with these COVID days, a lot more people have hand sanitizer,
Right.
or alcohol. And if it's an adult, you know, kill it, but put it in a plastic bag or whatever, and keep it in the freezer till one of the ag departments comes out, and, you know, they want to verify that it is. Also, you know, you want to record the location. So if you either GPS, or, you know, if you have what vineyard it was, record that, and you know, definitely report it. And again, if growers don't report it themselves, they can contact us and we can report it for them.
Yes.
But it's very important that you report it as soon as you know, as soon as you can when you find it. And then
I would also suggest, excuse me, it was part of a spotted lanternfly meeting that I attended yesterday, is tracking Tree of Heaven, knowing where it is, how close it is to your vineyards. And if you have it near your vineyard, we want to kind of map that because it is a host of the spotted lanternfly and they are going to go to Tree of Heaven at some point. So it might narrow our search if when we're out there scouting and looking. So we would like to know if you have Tree of Heaven, and we can also go by and check every once in a while. So if you guys know you have it or you're concerned that you might have it, reach out to one of us members and we can help you identify that.
And the other thing is, that's a good point, Jen, but Tree of Heaven, definitely know what it looks like. There are fact sheets that you can contact us. There's fact sheets in YouTube videos where they do a good job of identifying and showing you how to identify Tree of Heaven. There's couple ones out of Penn State that one of the forestry extension people did was I think lookalikes, because there's definitely lookalikes.
Black walnut.
Yeah, black. And again, mentioned in black walnut is while you're out there too, not just Tree of Heaven, but if you're looking in your woods or close to it, you know, it's close to a vineyard. Black walnut's a big host. Wild grapevines, you know, are also a big host. So, you know, check those out. We had a grower from southeastern PA contact us, and I think it was this year. I think they only had like 5-10 acres, but they sent us a aerial photo of their vineyards, and they're just surrounded by woods. And they've been scouting, and they're only picking up periodic, 10, 15 during the scouting. And, she also then looked into the woods, and she said, much, much higher numbers, and she was finding egg masses. So probably what happened is this was the first year, that it came into the area, and they were starting to move in the vineyard, but populations hadn't built up that high yet that there were large influxes or large masses of them like there have been in other areas. And but they built up in the woods more and first, and that's kind of like what I think we're going to see here. And that's what happened, I think, in the southeast. They were undetected for, who knows how many years, at least a few, I would say, until their numbers really built up. And then we started seeing them, in vineyards and apple orchards and things like that. So it's really important, and growers, hopefully they're not getting sick of this, but we're going to keep reminding them as much as we can to scout for it, to look at the fact sheets, and really know how to identify the different life cycles, and then report it. And if you can, also let us know so that we're aware of it, or we can report it for you.
Right. Thank you about that, Andy.
And I'll end on, I guess, another. This is a negative note, but again, it's not if we're going to see it, but it's when.
It's when.
It's just inevitable. But the sooner we pick it up, early detection, the better chance we're going to have to manage this.
So along those same lines, just not invasives, but just in terms of insect and disease, one of the things I did hear is that, and this isn't surprising at all, that there was a lot more juice or water in the berries, so they were seeing higher juice yields per ton of grapes this year, up maybe 6 or 7% from their long-term average. And that also, not surprisingly, has declined over the past 10 days as berries have dehydrated. But the only thing that's interesting is that it looks to me like that's extremely variable. So I've heard this from a number of growers where some of the vineyards, or maybe parts of vineyards, are very, very dry, even, becoming difficult to harvest that they're so dry. whereas others have maintained their, at least to the eye, very similar condition of probably more juice than normal per ton, or certainly average.
Different soil structures?
I mean, obviously it's happening by woods, and I would assume that's berry moth, but I suppose it could also be diseases. But no, I don't think it's soil structure. I think it's related to some level of vineyard care, which is what makes it interesting. I think just watching all of the berries dehydrate from, like, of course we had large berries at the beginning and the crop was, heavier than normal and producing more juice, and now it's less, but there just have been some reports of, grapes that are basically solid masses, and then some that are still very, very juicy.
You mean
Have
in
you ever
regards to border rows and then inside of blocks, and that's what you're talking about? 'Cause
I
I've
mean,
seen
that's what I've seen, but most of the growers I've talked to have said that it's whole blocks, and that's not what I've seen, but that's what they've mentioned, is that whole loads are going in, so with so much juice in them still that they're difficult to haul, and then other loads are, difficult to load and unload because they're so dry. Andy, have you ever seen, I mean, do you see that from berry moth, or could it be anything?
It could be, a lot of times that's common from berry moth.
Yeah.
Very common. But, with all this rain too, in some of those areas where possibly they didn't have berry moth before, with the berry splitting, and then once the berries split, you get secondary pathogens that come in, different fungi. You'll start to get more fruit flies. I mean, a real good indicator, especially towards the borders, if you got waves and waves of fruit flies,
Yeah.
then that's a good indication of probably berry moth also, because they're injured. And then once the berries are injured, then the fruit flies come in. But, I've also seen it, and there have been years where growers have said, a couple years ago, we got this berry splitting, and a lot of guys are saying, all this rot and the berries are light and everything else. Well, they're splitting, secondary organisms come in, fruit flies come in, it spreads some of this with sour rot. I mean, we were even having growers, which I never really heard from them, mentioning sour rot in Concords.
Okay.
And not that it, can't happen. It can, especially when you have, a lot of fruit flies around. But generally, with the sour rot, it's the tight clustered wine grape varieties that it's much more common, and it's not as common in Concords because they're looser clusters. But if it's a year where you get a lot of splitting, secondary organisms moving in, or fruit flies, spreading some of the sour rot organisms, then it is possible. But there's a lot of other secondary fungi that can move in that will cause these rots. There's penicillium, rhizopus, a lot of different secondaries that'll come in, and when it gets like that, it's really difficult to determine, which is the primary cause of it.
Jen, do you have anything that might also cause that, sort of from a nutritional perspective, or?
the dehydration of.
Well, I don't know if it's all dehydration, but it seems like there's dehydration and shelling and crop loss. And again, that's typically not very interesting. Usually by the 27th of October, I would say no matter where you go, it looks awful. But it just seems, at least to me, that it's more variable this year, or at least more variable on the 27th of October than it normally is. Maybe that's what it is we're just not quite there yet.
Well, I don't know about nutritional. I've had a lot of petiole samples, a lot of soil samples coming in, and to be quite honest with you, things were looking pretty good in most of the samples. Yes, we have acidic soils out there. People are working on that, but as far as tissue sampling, everything is in range, a little bit low on phosphorus in some of them. Potassium, there were borderlines in some. Nothing that would caused me to say, whoa, what's going on?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have an answer other than it definitely looks different than what I'm accustomed to seeing, but I
Now,
don't know.
some of that shelling, could be, I mean, when you see the rakuses or the pedicels starting to brown and shut down,
Hmm.
um, I've seen that before,
I've
and
seen that.
it may or may not be due to disease, because you can get phomopsis come in there, or downy mildew. The other thing I've seen in Concords, it generally, if it's an average crop and they can handle powdery mildew more. This definitely isn't an average crop. And so, another factor I'll throw out there is, depending on how much powdery mildew you had in your vineyard, um, I've I've seen it where, you know, the rakuses will be affected. And, I know in the past, and I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast, that, when I was doing samples out when I worked at the Northeast Lab, Grape Lab, that when we would be doing fungicide trials, our controls that we didn't have any powdery mildew control, um, you'd have to harvest them and put them in the cold room, and those rakuses would go down a lot faster. They had, they were covered with powdery mildew, and then when you took them out, the ones where you treated, would hold up a lot better. And then the control blocks that had a lot of powdery, those rakuses would, go downhill a lot faster. So that's another possibility, with depending on how heavy your inoculum levels were with powdery, how good a control you did with a heavy crop. So all those things, come into play.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from a cost perspective, I think it would be really nice to know like what the source of the crop loss was, so you could plan on managing differently when you knew you had a very large crop, but probably managing everything differently when you have a large crop is not a bad idea. Just taking more care than you're accustomed to and understanding that it's probably, you're closer to the edge in terms of managing, taking advantage of the resistance Concord offers and the vine stress that can be avoided. You need to do more to help that vine. Um, but
Well,
again, it all goes back to the idea that this is a very good year. It's just there were certainly some management decisions that's that took a little bit away from it being an even better year for some growers. That's all. It was still very good so far. Andy, did you have something to add or?
yeah, I was just going to say that, like you had mentioned before, Kevin and Jen, that this year, it was a little tougher than usual to predict as large a crop. Now, hopefully,
Mhm.
growers did crop estimations, which we always advise them to do. But like you said, with the bigger berry size, that was another added factor that came into play that they couldn't have predicted, growers themselves. So that's why we have maybe even a larger crop than a lot of guys even thought, above and beyond what the maybe what they pruned for.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of what I would have seen is growers, and this is a round example, but growers would have done a crop estimation and estimated between 9 and 11 tons per acre, and it would have actually have been 13. And maybe they would have been closer, but I'm sort of judging that conservatively. And a lot of the crop estimates came in at 6 to 7. So there's a
Oh,
really big difference in terms of your risk and your care when you think you have 6 versus you think you have 10. And there's not a huge difference between 10 and 13. I mean, there might be some thinning decisions that were impacted, but I don't think there would be any other decisions that were impacted. I mean, I think if you have a 10-ton crop, you should be, or you probably are, doing a lot of the extra things you can do to make sure that it gets ripe. Um, Maybe that would have impacted a thinning decision, and that's where it wouldn't have been perfect, but that's about it.
That's where I was just thinking about when you were talking is if you were off a little bit on that crop estimation and your vines normally could handle an 8 and you thought you were pushing it to 10, but it was actually 12. That's where you're
Right.
running into.
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, there's definitely. I mean, the wild card that is berry size can certainly confound some of your risk management decisions. But I do think anybody who thought they had 10 when they did crop estimation would have, managed a vineyard differently than they would have if they had 6 or 7. And
Right.
not just vineyard management, but also just trying to plan for harvest has been a real challenge, I think, for some growers because they put together a plan and a schedule that was based on harvesting 1,000 tons, and now they're trying to figure out how to harvest 2,000 tons. So, and that's just random example. But that's about how far off some of the estimates are. So I think we can help growers get those numbers a lot closer.
One thing before we go, I just want to add that when you were talking about crop insurance, Kevin,
Yeah.
being a little bit sarcastic.
I knew you were listening.
When you nodded off a little bit, Andy, is that what?
When I made a little bit of a sarcastic comment about, that not being of interest to me. But I really do want to say that the business management end of producing grapes or any agricultural commodity and the issue of crop insurance is, all kidding aside, is extremely important. I mean, because, in our experience, at least in mine, most of the growers, or at least I would say some of the older growers, farming, they like to do the farming end, and the business management end wasn't as interesting to them. But actually, that is the most important. I mean, we're in there not to just grow a crop. We're in there to make money and to make a living. So so I guess I'm saying, Kevin, you might be a lot more important than we all recognize in the scheme of things.
Aw, that was nice, Andy.
It was, and that might be the last very nice comment. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, business management and I think growers nowadays are more attuned to that. And if they're not, they definitely should be.
Right.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, 50% of good business management in farms is still going to be good horticulture practices. A lot of what we do integrates really well together because a lot of times the right decision for controlling a disease is also the right decision for increasing yield, is also the right decision for, having a successful business. It's not typically the case, although we do like to laugh about some of those exceptions. It's not typically the case that you do the wrong horticultural thing to make more money. But occasionally that does happen.
and you'll bring that up to us, Kevin, if you.
Yep. Those are always fun things to focus on, but that's not typically what it is. So thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week. And for those of you who are done harvesting, I hope there's a couple of you out there. I hope you enjoy the rest of your fall season. And for those of you who have a ways to go, best of luck to you. And again, we'll be back next week with some more information. Thanks a lot.
Take care, everybody.